Hey everybody, this is Dr. Osborne. Welcome to Monday night's rendition or edition, however you want to call it, of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Tonight I've got a special guest coming on here shortly, so we're going to get the show rolling. You guys know the rules. If you don't know the rules and you're new to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain, I want to know where you're from. So go ahead and chime in, say hello. Let me know where you're tuning in from, and we will get this show going here shortly. Additionally, I would love to I would love for you to share this information with anybody that you know that might benefit from learning more about functional medicine, especially tonight's topic, which is all about cancer. I've got a very special guest who's a terminal cancer survivor who's going to talk about his journey and his mission. So if you know somebody who's in that field or in that struggle, make sure you're sharing this with them and pass this along. So before we get started, again, we'll go through. If you've got questions, go ahead and start chiming in, especially if you've got cancer-related questions about cancer support, nutritional supplementation, those types of things. We'll ask our special guest to answer those for you before the show ends. So we're going to get going here in just a minute. We've got Sandy from Ontario, Canada, and Rachel from Michigan. We got Bobby from Denton, Texas. Hi, Bobby. We've got Kim from North Carolina and Lang from Philly, Pennsylvania. Marianne from Colorado. Elena from Denver. Two Coloradians. I guess that's how you say it. I've never said Coloradians before. We got Lynn from South Australia. So we're representing a couple different continents here tonight. And I know there's more of you tuning in here. So again, let us know where you're from and say hello and get your questions. Go ahead and type in so we can do our best to get as many of those answered before we run out of time tonight. Vincent from Houston and Ember from Ontario, Canada, and Charlene from Southeast Texas, and Donna from Fort Lauderdale. So again, lots of you tuning in. We're going to go ahead and bring our guest in tonight. Really, it's going to be a great show. We've got James Templeton with us. James, can you hear us coming in okay? All right. Oh, we got a sound issue not coming in on your end. So let's do a mic check. Again, yeah, okay. So we're going to do a quick sound check here. And again, what we're going to be talking about tonight is James and how he overcame cancer and, from a terminal diagnosis. And he's got a great new book out too. So those of you looking for help and guidance and support in that journey, you can pick a copy up of I Used to Have Cancer. We're going to be talking about that tonight. So stay tuned. We're going to try this again and see if we can't get sound up and running here. James, can you hear me okay? Yeah, still not coming in. I don't know if it's a what kind of an audio issue we're having here. Let's see here. Yeah, it looks like our audio is running smooth on this side. James, you might want to log out and log back in and see if that doesn't fix your audio. Okay, so while we're waiting, I'm sorry, folks, we're just having a little bit of a technical difficulty issue, but they're going to try to log back in and see if we can get better sound. So while we're waiting, and I want to talk a little bit about the weekend I had. I was lecturing over actually in Houston, which is just my backyard here. I was doing a lecture this weekend to a bunch of doctors, and it was a great weekend. We talked all about how gluten and grains can impact the brain. I've got some special videos coming out for you this week, so make sure you stay tuned to our YouTube channel because I've got a couple of really good videos on grain and brain health, and want to make sure that that you know that's coming out. And they're both based off the lecture I just gave. What we did is we just tried to make it simpler without as much technical speak so that it was applicable to you. Let's see if we can get James back in here and hopefully get this sound issue taken care of here. So sound is great on your end. You guys are hearing me loud and clear. There we go. I can hear you now, James.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Is my voice loud enough?
Yeah, let's ask the audience. Audience, can you hear? If you can hear James coming in loud and clear, just chime in and let us know that he's coming in. There's a little bit of background noise, James. I don't know if there's anything else going on in the background, but there's just a little bit of background noise.
Okay.
That's okay. I can hear you though. It's definitely sound versus not.
Yeah.
All right.
Well.
Yep, I'm getting people telling you to hear us.
I'll just talk really loud.
How about that?
Being from Texas, I know how to talk loud.
Yeah, my fellow Texan. So, we were just at a conference together in February, and Ann Louise Gittleman, who I've had on the show before, was one of our speakers at the conference, and that's in a big way how you and I were fortunate enough to meet. And I love your story. I love what you're doing. I love your mission. So why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about where you're coming from. I'd love for you to share your background, your story, and kind of why you wrote this book.
Well, this has been quite a few years ago, but I was living in Texas. That's where I'm from, and I was living in a town, Huntsville, Texas, actually, north of where you're at. And I thought I had everything going for me. I had very successful lifestyle. I had 3 very successful small businesses, and I had a beautiful wife, a little daughter that was not even 2 years old, a beautiful little daughter, and I thought I was doing everything, and I thought everything was going great, and I was even.
Oh, I don't know what just happened. We lost you. Okay, you're back. Yep, you're back.
Okay, and I became a big runner. I got into the fitness side of things, and I had a lot of heart disease in my family, and my father, my grandfather, they both died at young ages. My grandfather at 36, my father at 46. And I always thought, well, after my father died, I was in high school, senior in high school, and after that I was very depressed, and I thought, I'm going to be the next one. I'll be lucky if I live to be 30. So I, found running, and I found exercise. And there was a guy back then, his name was Jim Fix. And he was a guy that wrote books about running, about how healthy it was to run, and about you can probably just about do anything you want as long as you exercise a lot. And so I believed him, and I got into this running thing, and I was doing really well. And one day I went into the office early in the morning. I got the newspaper, and I sat down at my office, and I read this headline. It says, "Running Guru Jim Fix dies while jogging." And I was like, oh my gosh, how could that happen? How could this guy die? He was 52 years old. So it got my attention. It made me think I better kind of look at everything, and maybe I should go get a stress test or something, try to get checked out to make sure I wasn't next. And so I went to the doctor. I went to a specialist that did these stress tests there, and the guy got me on the treadmill, and he says, James, he says, you are in tremendous shape. He said, you broke the all-time record on my treadmill test. He says, I think that your heart's in good shape. There's no problem there. He says, you're actually the picture of health. You seem to be really good. He said, but he said, there's only one thing I can see. He says, there is a mole on your back. And he says, it looks a little different. It's probably nothing to it, but, you ought to get it checked out sometime. Just go to a dermatologist and get checked out. Well, I didn't think much about it, and he said, don't worry, it's probably nothing. So a few weeks later, I decided to go to a dermatologist, and I go into the dermatologist, and he says, let's look at this mole, and he looked at it, and he just started to get all excited, and it started freaking out almost. And he says, oh my gosh, he says, I think we got an issue here. He says, I think you have melanoma. And I didn't even know what melanoma was. It sounded scary to me, but it was something I'd heard of, but didn't know a lot about it. And he says, I think you have melanoma, but he says, we'll have to see to make sure. But he says, you could die from this. And he started talking like that, and here I just hadn't been there very long. He says, we're going to have to remove this from your back. We might have to remove a large portion of your back. And at that point, I was like in shock already, you know, and this guy didn't have very good bedside manner. And I said to myself then, I'm not going to go back to this guy no matter what. But I'll see you later. I said, I'm going to go think about this and go home. And I went home, and my wife said, well, let's get another opinion. And she said, it's probably nothing. Let's just get another opinion. So we did, and we went to a dermatologist that I'd seen before. And this dermatologist looked at it, and he says, well, I think it's suspicious to me, too. And, you know, kind of said that he thought I should go to a real specialist. He said the real specialist was an oncologist, and he was down there in Houston at one of those hospitals down there. And he said, this guy's going to know for sure, and he's a good friend of mine. So I go in there, and the guy looks at it, and he says, well, it looks kind of suspicious to me also. He said, but, you know, the only way we're going to know is let's take it off. Let's get rid of it. Let's take it out. And he said, we do that right here in the office. So he went in, took a big, you know, plug out of my back, and probably 2 inches square plug. And he says, you know, let's just send it to the lab. We'll see what it is. And he says, I wouldn't worry about it. He said, just go on home. Don't worry. Well, I mean, that's like, don't worry. You know, here I am, you know, waiting for a phone call from the doctor, and he's telling me not to worry. Well, that's all I did was worry. I went home. I couldn't sleep. You know, I was pacing the floor. You know, James, you know, I was always this happy-go-lucky guy, kind of, you know, full of energy and like to have fun and do all this. And now I'm worrying. So the guy calls me, the doctor calls me. It's probably about a week and a half or more later. And here I am, you know, like it seemed like a year, you know. So I'm there, and this guy calls me up, and he says, well, I got some good news and I got some bad news. And he went on to say that the good news was it was melanoma. And I went, good news? Melanoma? That's good news? And he says, but the good news is we think we got it all. And around the perimeter of that area that we removed the mole, we think we got everything. So he said, that's good news. He said, the bad news is it's very deep. And it was very deep in the tissue, which is considered stage 4 on something called the Clark scale. And I didn't know anything about it, but stage 4, he says, we're going to have to keep an eye on it. We're going to really have to watch it. This is the kind of cancer that can spread to other organs. He says the only thing you can do is come in and see me every 3 months or so, and we'll get it checked out. We'll look at your body. We'll feel your lymph nodes. You know, we're going to check and kind of stay ahead of it and make sure that, you know, we're on top of things. So he said, just go on home. Don't worry. You know, just live your life. There's nothing you can do. He said, there's absolutely nothing to worry about, but just live. So here I am after that. I'm really worried now because I started to read everything I could about melanoma. And, you know, there wasn't the internet back then. You know, now you plug in something, you can get anything you want in about 5 minutes. But there wasn't the internet. So I'm looking around, and my wife had told me, she says, you know, a doctor friend of mine that actually I had met before said that people that live, that have melanoma don't live, usually stage 4 melanoma, don't live more than 3 years on the average. So I'm like, 3 years? My whole life is 3 years here. I've got this thing, and, you know, I was just a total wreck after that. I didn't want to work. I had no ambition anymore. I didn't want to do anything. I was grumpy. I was like, you know, didn't sleep. I had a baby daughter. She was a toddler. And, you know, I just, every time I'd look at her, I would be upset, you know, and I felt so bad. Here I am, and maybe I don't have 3 years. I mean, it's like, what am I going to do? Well, I went ahead and went on down to the doctor, got checked out. The first time, everything checked out okay. He says, everything's good. He said, come back in 3 months. Well, I felt a little better, but, you know, still, I went home and I still went through my routine. I didn't really want to be the same guy, or wasn't the same guy that I had been, all these years. And so, then I just wasn't fun to be around. I was, just a real depressed wreck, and before I knew it, it started causing problems with my marriage, and my wife decided to move out and take my daughter with her. And after that, I think I kind of lost my will at that point, because I was so depressed. Now look what I've done. I've not only have this, I've run my wife off, and I'm really a mess now. So I go back to the doctor again. He says, everything's okay. Don't worry. But by then, I was so down in the dumps that I started going out and drinking and hanging out with my friends and people that I used to hang out with. And, that wasn't the right thing to do, but, at least it got it off my mind. And, long story short, before I knew it, I was in the shower, and I felt a lump in my groin, and it was kind of like a marble. And I thought, oh boy, that doesn't seem right. So I went in, and the doctor says, well, it's probably nothing to worry about. Let's just have you come back in 3 months. And he said, let's see if it, gets any bigger or not. Well, it started getting bigger and bigger, because I was constantly feeling of it and trying to make sure, it's just. So it got bigger, and I went back into the doctor not too long after that at all. And he says, I think we're going to have to go in and see what this is. So he goes in, and he did the surgery, and he said he says, it probably won't be anything. We'll just do a little incision. It probably won't be anything, but we need to see what it is. So he goes in, he does it, and I wake up, and, once I came to from this surgery, I knew I was in trouble, because I had this huge incision, all this bandaging and everything here in my groin. So he came in shortly after that, and he told me, he says, well, I'm sorry, but, this cancer has spread to your lymphatic system. And he said, that's not what we wanted to see. He says, I'm sorry that this happened. He says, I recommend that we do 80 chemotherapy treatments. He wanted to do experimental chemotherapy, which was a type of hypothermia, treatment where they elevate my temperature as high as they could without it basically killing me. And then they would inject or induce through IV, the chemotherapy. And he said, we're going to do 5 treatments after you recover from the surgery. And we'll go back in after that, and every 2 months we'll do another one. But he also said to me, he says, you've also got to use this lymph drainage pump, because I'd had all the lymph nodes removed, all the major lymph nodes. And he says, you're going to have to do this pump, elevate your leg, do this pump. He says, we don't want you to lose your leg. He said, all that drainage, you're going to get edema there, and we don't want that. And so you got to be very careful with this. So I had to do that several hours a day. And this went on for quite a while. And then he said to me, he says, well, I'm also going to go ahead and tell you. He didn't want to tell me, but I kind of got it out of him. He says, you got about a 20% chance of living 3 to 5 years if you can get through these 80 treatments. He says, if you don't do the treatments, he said, I don't think there's a hope for you, And so here I am, being depressed before. Now I'm really in bad shape. Here I'm laying there recovering from this surgery, and it was really major surgery when you have something like that done. And, you're on morphine and all that stuff for the pain. And I'm laying there, and I'm getting pretty desperate. I've got to find an answer. And I went from depressed to not caring to I can't give up, kind of feeling back and forth and all that. And then I was kind of gotten really rock bottom and just felt terrible. And I just thought that was it for me, And I got a phone call. And the phone call was from a minister of a church that I went to, pretty regular. I didn't go every week, but I'd go pretty regular to a Christian church. And he was a a minister, and I knew him, and he was a runner, and he was an older man than me, but he was a runner, and he was an ex-baseball player for, in the major leagues. And, I had retired and gone into the ministry, and he calls me up on the phone. He says, listen, he said, James, he said, I heard about you. I've been praying for you. He said, lots of people are praying for you, and he said, I just want you to know. He says, you got to fight. You cannot give up. He said, you get in there and you knock heads with this cancer. And he says, I don't want you to even think about giving up. And he says, you're gonna go out there and you're gonna beat this SOB in cancer, And I mean, he said that. He said it all out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, here's this guy that I thought he was a nice guy. It doesn't mean he's not nice, but the way he said it got my attention. And I felt like I was in a locker room at halftime and we were losing, and in a championship game, and the coach was getting on us and chewing us out and saying, you got to fight harder. You guys got to get in there and dig in and knock heads and win. You can win. And if anybody can do it, you can do it, kind of mentality. And, just something clicked inside of me after that. After I hung up the phone, I started to pray. And I mean, I prayed. I've never prayed that hard in my life. And I wasn't a guy that went around praying a lot and all this. I was a young guy, but, I prayed to God, and I told God, I said, look, I haven't been that great of a person at times, and I haven't, I just really spilled the beans out, and I never felt anything like that myself before. I felt like every cell and every part of my body was praying. I felt like there's an energy, it was just like this calming energy that I had never experienced before, and I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. And but I felt this energy, and I prayed so hard. And when I got through praying, it was probably 20 minutes or so later, I got a knock on the door. And it was knocking. I said, come in. And it was a friend of mine I hadn't seen in 7 years from college. And this guy comes in, and he's waving a piece of paper, and he's saying, I'm sorry to hear you're in here. A friend of mine, or a friend of ours and from college told me about you. And he said, I just feel terrible. And I just felt like, I was driving around, and, I didn't know if I should come in and see you or not, but something just told me to just go in there and see you. And I was not too far away, and something just grabbed me and said, you go in there. And he had this piece of paper, and the paper was a book review. And the book review was about a guy that healed himself of cancer using a diet, nutrition and diet. Well, I didn't know anything like that. And this guy told me, he says he didn't know much about it other than this guy, a friend of his at work, gave it to him to give to me. And I looked at that and I said, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do. I knew there's something inside of me says, this is what you're supposed to do. Yes, I want to know more about it. So I told him, I said, let me see this. So I looked at it, and I got very excited because it was a book review about this guy that cured himself on a macrobiotic diet. And he was a well-known actor. It was on TV, and his name was Dirk Benedict. And he was on a TV show back then for people that are more my age, that was called The A-Team. And this was a guy on there, and there was these guys, what was his name, Mr. T, I guess, or whatever it was, and all these guys. Well, he was the blonde-headed guy that was on there, if anybody sees these, or if they've seen the repeats even. But anyway, this guy had cancer, and at least he thought he had cancer. He had prostate cancer. He was a young guy, and he had healed himself on this diet. And I got so excited because I said, this guy was from Montana. He grew up on a ranch. And I was living up in Huntsville there, and I had a few cows, and I thought I was kind of a cowboy like him, I guess, a little bit. And, and I could relate to him. And he talked about how he went for broke, and he just went all out, and if it didn't work for him, it wasn't going to work for anybody. And I just could really relate to him. And I got excited. My whole body I was just excited. I've got something now. I've got something I can get excited about, give something that can give me some hope. So I had my friend go out and get the book. He went out and got that book, and he came right back and he found it. And he brought it back, and I read that book till I fell asleep that night in the hospital. And I wasn't in great shape, but I tell you what, you wouldn't have known it because I was just, eating that book up. And the next morning I was excited, and then I got another knock on the door, and my stepmother that came through the door, and she had this book in her hand. She says, one of my nieces sent me this book. And she says, I don't know much about it, but it's about vitamin C and cancer. Well, I mean, I never, like I said before, when I got sick, I went to the doctor, and that was all you know. And I didn't know anything about vitamin C, really. But it was about Linus Pauling's book. And Linus Pauling had written a book about vitamin C and cancer and people that were terminally ill, and how well that a lot of them did when they took certain amounts of vitamin C, higher dosage of vitamin C. Some were IV, some oral, and some, both. And, these people were living a lot longer, at least with the vitamin C, and that some were even getting well. And, I got excited again. I said, well, my gosh, vitamin C, I'm starting to get some answers here now. I got this new diet, and I got the vitamin C, and I'll do both of them, and I'm going to do the chemo too. So I'm getting excited. I'm really thinking that now, if it'll help all these people and these people, I've been a runner. I've pushed myself. I know I can do it. If they can do it, I can do it. So the next day, I got another knock on the door. It was like 3 days, right? in a row. Every day, I got this special visitor. And here comes the guy through the door. And he was this guy, and he says, look, he said, I am the psychotherapist for the hospital. And he says, I heard you were depressed, and I heard you were, down in the dumps, and that, you were just not doing that well. And I wanted to come talk to you. Is that something I can do? And I said, sure. He says, well, I'll be back first thing in the morning. So he comes back, and he comes through the door, and I'd already planned on what I was going to ask him. He comes through that door, and I said, I got to ask you a question. And he says, okay. And I said, have you ever heard of anything, or any diet called the macrobiotic diet? And he says, hold on a second. He was over by my bed. He goes back over to the door. He shut the door tight. He comes back to me. He says, I'll tell you what I know about this diet, but you got to promise me that you will not tell anybody, because I'll lose my job. He says, I'll lose my pension, my retirement, all that. And he says, I can't, these people would not put up with me talking about this around here in this kind of place. This was a cancer, ward, it's a whole thing. And he went on to tell me, he says, this diet's helped a lot of people. And he said, I think that it's a good diet. He says it's not easy to follow. It's a lot to do. But, you've got to roll up your sleeves. You got to go to war with this stuff. And, you got to really dig in. And he says, if you do it right and really don't cut any corners, I think it could be very successful for you or anyone else. But it's hard for people. He said, I even tried this diet, and it didn't work for me because I couldn't stick with it. It took too much of my time and energy, and I just couldn't put 100% into it. And I don't think he had cancer. I think he was maybe he had other issues, but he didn't get into that. But he just said to me, he says, you don't seem depressed. After all, I come in here and you seem like you're kind of, a different person than what they described. He said, you seem like you're ready to do something. He said, I think this might work for you. And he said, but again, you have to always remember that you can't cut any corners. He said, you got to, this is serious business. And he says, I think you'll do very well. So then he gave me 2 other books to go read. And he said, these are books that about a doctor that cured himself using this diet. Well, I got really excited now because now this guy's coming in here, closing the door, all this, telling me, that it's in secret that this diet could really help me, and at a hospital of all, and this is, 33 years ago. And he tells me that, and I didn't know a hill of beans about anything, but I was so excited now. So then after I got all this, I was about time to get my chemotherapy. So I was going to do, all of those things. I got those other books that he brought, and I'm going to do the chemotherapy. I'm going to do it all because if a little's good, a lot's better. So I'm going to do it all. I was excited. Well, I did the chemo, but that was terrible stuff. I mean, they elevated my temperature, and I had these weighted blankets, and my body was shaking, and I was freezing. I felt like I was in the North Pole or something. I mean, I was just, my whole body was like a freezer or something. But I got through it. It was 5 days, and I probably went home, maybe a couple days after that, kind of recovered a little bit. And I barely could walk or get around, but, I went home. I started reading everything I could about the macrobiotic diet. And I started to cook a little bit with it, and I thought, well, I'm going to get started on this. So I started off with, just beans and a little bit of miso soup and rice and things like that back then. And it was very simple, but that's all I knew to do at the beginning until I could learn more about it. But before I knew it. And I was doing a lot better, and I wasn't doing the vitamin C yet. I just kind of had to take one step at a time. But I was really, really trying to educate myself. So the 2 months later came before I even could imagine. It was time to do the chemo again. So I go into the hospital, check in to the hospital, and I remember going in, and all these people were getting ready to get their chemo and all that, and most of them were doing, different. Chemotherapy trials and this and that. And there was this one woman, I remember, she says, well, I'm ready to get my chemo so I can get out of this. I'm ready to get back to normal living, And I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm going to be ready for mine too. So I go back in there and they must have tripled it because I felt so bad. I mean, it was the worst thing I ever did in my life. And I mean, the first time wasn't near as bad. And, I told them once, I said, give me a lot of it. I want a lot. I want it to work, and so they gave me that chemo. And I mean, I was sick. I mean, I was really sick. So I remember like maybe 2 days into it, I mean, I was just miserable. It was terrible. I remember the nurse saying to me, she's saying, not to me, but to someone in the room. I was just almost felt like I was unconscious. And I'm laying, and she said, who's been watching this man's temperature? It's way too high. This is dangerous. He could have died in here. Who's been doing this? I'm laying there, I'm hearing all this. And I'm saying to myself, boy, that's terrible. And every night, when I was there in the hospital the time before, and in that time, I'd hear people, a lot of commotion in the hallway, and I'd find out that somebody died, and a lot of it was because they got pneumonia. And, all this chemotherapy was destroying their immunity, and they were getting pneumonia and everything else, and I didn't want to be next. So I made up my mind that I was going to start asking some questions. And I talked to that doctor, and I said, listen, this stuff is making me sick. I can't eat. I'm throwing up. It's terrible. He says, well, I'm sorry, but you're not responding very well. He said, we had hoped that you'd respond better. And he said, unfortunately, you're not. And this is all I know to do. And I said, well, what would you do if it was your son or daughter? He says, I'd do the same thing. I said, you'd do the same thing knowing that it wasn't responding. And, what about another diet or a vitamin C therapy or something like that? And he goes, none of that. Just forget all that kind of stuff. None of that stuff is going to help you. None of that works. So I'm like, okay, this guy's started to make me nervous here. He's telling me that nothing else is going to work. And again, I was believed in the doctor and everything, and at that point. And he's telling me that, and he said, there's just nothing else you can do, but keep doing this. That's all we know to do. Well, and I said, well, I'm going to end up dying in here. with this stuff. He goes, well, we're all going to die someday, just like that. And when he said that to me, I tell you what, I raised up in that bed, and I was weak, and I was just really thin already, and I just, with all this stuff, I had no energy. But I raised that bed, and I said, listen here. I started pointing my finger at him, and I said, listen here, you SOB. And I didn't say it like that either, but I said, if I could get out of this bed, I'd tear you apart. And that guy turned around, he walked out the door, and like he'd seen a ghost, and he was just like, I never saw him. I never saw that doctor again. And this was this big time oncologist, surgeon, and everything. And I never saw him again. And I decided then that I was getting out of that hospital. I don't care. I'm getting out of there. So I did a couple of more chemotherapy treatments, and I got out of there. And I snuck out of the hospital at 2:00 in the morning. And I could barely get out of there. I was just basically crawling out of there because I was so weak and sick that I knew I had to get out of there because I had no energy. And I never felt like that. It was like I felt like hardly very little of me was still alive. It was terrible. And I crawled down the stairs. I snuck down kind of along the wall, and there was a nurse station at one end, and I looked, and I'd look out my door, and if I didn't see anybody, then I said, I'm going to ease out, and I went on down the stairs, and I got in my car, and I got out of there, and I drove up to my stepmother's house, which was an hour, and I was so sick that I stopped twice on the side of Interstate 45 and threw up. And it was at 2 a.m, and I knew I had so much poison in me that I had to get it out of there. So I went back to my stepmother's, and I decided that time that I walked out of the hospital, I said, now I'm going to war. I'm going to battle. I'm going to fight till the end. If it doesn't work for me, it's not going to work for anybody else. I'm not going to cut any corners. I am going to train. Like a guy training for something, I am going to do my all best, 100%, 150%. And I am not going to, if I go down, it's not because I haven't tried. And that's what I made up my mind that day. And when I got to my mother's, I started to, went out and got vitamin C and all that stuff, and started taking. I didn't know what I was doing. I was sort of like kind of like that other guy had the book Confessions of a Kamikaze Cowboy. Dirk Benedict's book was that's what it was called. And I felt like, well, I'm kind of a kamikaze cowboy too, and I'm going for it. And I, like I said, I read everything I could do. I really dug in, and I was actually working then, because the story's a long story. Everything's in the book, but I was working in Dallas, and I had to get back up there. But I got into this diet. I started taking high amounts of vitamin C, about 20,000 milligrams. Some days more, and most of the time probably 20,000. I didn't do the IVs back then, but I did this strict diet. And I would walk, I'd exercise, I'd do deep breathing, meditation, and I did a lot of visualization. And I just, within 3 months, I just felt like a different person. It's like that vitamin C really did something for me. And I didn't take any other supplements really, because I didn't know anything about supplements, then. And I thrived, and I got better and better and better, and never had another, problem. And, and I just went on, and I eventually ended up living at the Macrobiotic community up in Western Massachusetts. And ended up working there, and eventually became the operations manager because I'd had a business background. And this is a very long story, but the book's going to, explain all that, of course, and it's going to tell everyone exactly what I did and how I did it, and the foods that I ate and all that. But I just kept on going and thriving, and I was the kind of guy that would chew my food, because in the macrobiotic philosophy is they want you to chew your food very well, and they recommend like 50 times a mouthful. Well, I said 50 is not good enough. I'm doing 180. I don't know where I got 180, but that's what I did. So I would sit there and I'd chew my food 180 times until it was just liquid. And it took me a while, you can imagine, to eat, but we ate the diet, and the diet was so powerful because it detoxified. It really detoxified my body. It helped to alkalinize my body, and I'm sure I was very toxic because I'd had gas stations. I'd been around petrochemicals, the benzenes, the lead, you name it. I've been around PVC glues for 7 years. I was a pipe fitter, with PVC glues on and off, and breathing that stuff all the time when I was younger. And I had all kinds of mercury fillings in my mouth. I discovered all this along the way. And the other thing I discovered along the way, was parasites, intestinal parasites. And I didn't know. I mean, I always thought to myself that, when you have animals, the first thing the vet does is he looks for parasites. And I found out about that even. And I found out how important and how immunosuppressive parasites can be, and how important that, the gut health is, and macrobiotics use the, fermented foods, and they used a lot of all the cruciferous vegetables. I mean, if you look at everything, you can see why a diet like that would work. And I'm not saying that's the diet for everyone, because that was what I did back then. I don't follow that kind of diet now, but I follow, a diet that uses some of those principles. And, I don't eat all that grain, because 50% or more was grain. And I just couldn't handle it after, a few years. I couldn't eat that much grain anymore. And of course, I learned, like I know your work, I learned a lot of the problems with grains. And I learned, a lot of, the things that I know now, that if I had to do it over, I would probably do some things, and then I would change a lot, because, there's so much more out there now to learn. But I even did something called Iscador. That was, it's a mistletoe, and you might be familiar with that, but, I injected that for a year in my spleen area, and I found a doctor that was an anthroposophical doctor, and he was on the East Coast, and this was where I was living, was in Western Massachusetts. But this guy told me the reason I got sick, and that was kind of different, because he said the reason you got sick in the first place is because your body and spirit separated. And this was a Rudolf Steiner trained doctor from Germany. And I found that interesting, but he talked me into doing this Iscador for a year, because he said it would really just kind of help stimulate my immune system. And, I did stuff. I was open to doing things, but, I took one thing at a time, and I walked every day. I stopped all the running, because I felt like all that running was going to be a little too hard on my system. But there wasn't a day that I didn't go walk. Every day I walked, and I exercised, and I do deep breathing. And of course, by then I didn't really need that leg pump much more. But that was a problem for a while. But it didn't take me long, because of the food I was eating. And and once you get the toxicity out of your system, the lymph works a lot easier. And I thrived. And then after all this story, around about the whole story, I ended up meeting a teacher that was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she taught me a lot of things I learned that I use today. Her name was Dr. Hazel Parcells. And she was 106 when she passed away. And I learned so much from her. I actually spent some time with her and worked with her in her lab a little bit. But, it's amazing the journey. And it's amazing the things I all along the way. And after a few years, I was like a different person. I learned what it's like to be sick and what it's like to get healthy again, and why I got sick in the first place. And when I learned that, the reason I got sick was mostly because of my own fault and my own, being exposed to things. And it's not genetics. It's not all genetics. It's maybe 10% or so. And I learned about all these things. I learned the important things. I also learned about enzymes, the importance of enzymes. And, the macrobiotic, diet, I'm sure, helped me a lot. But then I learned later on about different supplements. And, there's so much research out there now, as you're aware of, I'm sure. That's pretty much the story. But, once I learned that I created a lot of this from my exposure, from my lifestyle, from low immune system, probably too much sun. People think of any kind of skin cancer, you got been in the sun too much, but and I'm sure that helped. But I think that a lot of the melanoma is caused from high amounts of pesticides, chemical exposure, things like that. And, once you start to get that stuff out of your system, I do a lot of saunas, far infrared saunas, not every day, but a lot of days, nearly every day. I do detox, I exercise, I don't run anymore. And I ran after that for a while, but you get to a certain age and, you start doing other things. But if I don't exercise or if I don't do something, it's kind of like a day without sunshine. So, and eat healthy. But if our diet is, we eat some meat and we eat different things now, but we use all organic and all, the best of the best. It's like you learn. It's not that hard for a lot of people. It's not that everybody's going to get well, because it takes a lot of this is 50% is believing in what you're doing, or more, I believe. And even a lot of people, I think, don't really believe, or maybe they don't roll up their sleeves enough. Maybe they're under a lot of stress. Maybe they're not able to get away from that for some reason. Maybe they're not getting the support. They're hanging around with the wrong friends, or there's being around like-minded people is so important. And having that support and that positive thinking, and that I can do it. If I can't do it, no one can kind of mentality. Just mind over matter. Just strong will. And it's not easy, but once you start to feel good and you start to see the results, you start to believe. And that's when I think that, it's kind of like the icing on the cake, the healing happens.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it's got to start in your mind. It's got to start in your heart. You got to have the belief that you can get better. Some of the things that you said along that journey, and thanks for sharing your story. I know a lot of people listening today maybe needed to hear that story of overcoming and that trial and tribulation that you went through. And a lot of people listening may have friends and family who need to hear that. So again, if you do, make sure you're sharing this information with them. But what you mentioned, 20 grams a day of vitamin C as kind of a therapeutic dose for yourself. And that was, it sounded like that was played a big role in what you were doing. And some people would kind of freak out when they hear 20 grams, but tell us a little bit about that. You took 20 grams a day for 6 months, for 9 months, for a year?
I took 20 grams for years. And, of course, nowadays you hear people taking 100,000 milligrams, or 100 grams, not 100,000, 100 grams in some days, with an IV. But no, I started off with that, and I was didn't know anything. I'd go to Whole Foods, and one of the first Whole Foods was in Dallas, Texas. And I would go there because I didn't know what to get. And I would go there, and I ended up getting a time-released vitamin C. It happened to be time-released, and the one that I used had lysine in there. And I just and magnesium. Well, it was buffered and it helped me, it was gentler on my stomach, but the time release was slowly releasing. And, you take it several times a day, and I would just pop it in, at each meal. And I took the vitamin C, but I never ever got, loose stools or anything really unusual. I didn't have diarrhea or anything like that. But you hear people that can. I mean, I probably could have taken 30 or 40. I don't know. Because in that Linus Pauling book, they talked about 10 grams, and I thought, well, I'll double it, because I didn't have any access to that. And I wasn't going to a doctor and get it, not with what I'd been through. So I just did that. But, to this day, I take a lot of vitamin C. I take about 15 to 16 grams a day, and I've taken all for over 30 years, I've been taking the vitamin C. I do other things too, but I've never had a problem. I've never had any kidney stones. I've never had any, what I'm saying. And I don't get sick at all, hardly ever. I bet you I haven't been sick, with flus, colds, things like that, probably maybe 3 times maybe in 20 years, of anything. And, I used to get sick all the time before I had the cancer. I was like wondering why I had so many sinus problems and why I had the flu all the time and why I had, anytime something came around, I got it. This was before I was diagnosed. Well, I thought, I was 30 years old and, 30 years old, you're older and you're getting stuff now. And that's how it is, I didn't know. And it's not normal to get that much because your immune system is struggling. There's something going on. And we're all going to get stuff from time to time. But I didn't understand. But I had so many problems with allergies. And once I got off of dairy, I got totally off of dairy. All those allergies cleared up. I never had another allergy after that. I even had polyps at one point right before that. And the doctor says, well, you got polyps and you got all these problems, and, that's probably just hereditary and all that stuff. But I for 10 years pumped gasoline at a full service gas station back then. And I sat there and breathed that gas. I used to like to smell up gasoline. Well, that stuff was full of lead and everything else. And you're breathing that stuff and you wonder why you got something. And and all the things I did and all that running that I did, and just beat myself up and didn't support myself, and I was tired all the time. I'd push harder because I thought, well, I'm weak. I got to get stronger because I was running these races and stuff and doing all this stuff. But yeah, the vitamin C is when I started taking that, I just felt like I had somebody injected me with some new life in me, and I'm a big believer in. I interview people now with my foundation, and a lot of these people almost every one of them that use high dose vitamin C.
Let's talk about your foundation, because you started the Templeton Wellness Foundation, and you get stories, you collect stories about people who've gone through it and what worked for them. Talk a little bit for our audience about some of the big you mentioned vitamin C. Everybody's story has that in common. Are there other things that you find that everyone had in common? I'm finding
they all changed their diet. They've all changed their diet. They're all eating organic food. They're detoxifying. They're doing all the things kind of that I eventually did there. They're not on necessarily on a macrobiotic diet, but some of them maybe are on. There's some of these people follow a vegan diet, and some people follow a grain-free diet. And some people eat grain, but a lot of them are doing vitamin C. They're doing hyperbaric. A lot of people doing oxygen therapies, ozone, hyperbaric. Their enzyme therapy. With high dose enzymes, which I think is one of the key things that's been overlooked by a lot of people. And I mean, I'm a big believer in that because of, the late Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, his work. I was always impressed with his work. And over the years, I've talked to quite a few people that have done very well on his program. And that I've got one fellow that actually lives in Houston area, north of Houston. He had pancreatic cancer that, basically is get your stuff together, and it's not if, it's when. And you get that, you get to talk to these people, and this guy says he feels better than he ever has in his life, and it's been 12 years, and he's on that program, and he eats pretty clean. He takes a lot of enzymes. And, the problem is most people that have cancer have a low amount of enzymes. Their enzyme bank, as I like to call it, is usually depleted. And enzymes are so important because they're one of our biggest defense mechanisms against cancer. Vitamin C, enzymes, those are two very, very important things that you need to look at, because the enzymes basically, high amounts, and I'm talking, I think you need to take smaller amounts with food and a lot between meals if you have cancer. Now, I don't take high amounts between meals. I take some between meals almost every day. But I'm on a preventative thing, and it's been so long. But these cancer cells, have these membranes. They're fibrinogen membranes. And that's just to protect them from the immune system. And, when we all have cancer cells in our body, it's whether our immune system can handle them or not, and whether it's doing its job. And when you start to get all this overabundance of toxicity in your system, then the immune system starts to shut down to a level to where it can't keep up with the cancer cells. And in many cases, I'm not saying it's everyone, but pancreatic cancer is really, really the key, is the enzymes. But, once you strip that membrane, now the cancer cells can recognize these cells and these tumors and start to go after them. That's the idea anyway. That was, Dr. John Beard's work from way back in the early 1900s. And then, there was William Donald Kelly's work, and then Nicholas Gonzalez, and his work is being done still by his ex-wife, which worked with him for years, Linda Isaacs. But this Dr. Linda Isaacs, but this guy that I interviewed, he went through that, and he's doing remarkable well, and he's doing everything to keep his immune system revved up and strong, and that's just one example.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Nick Gonzalez's work, and that with the coffee enemas is
yes,
part of his protocol as well. So
yeah, the coffee enemas are. I've done some coffee enemas and sometimes colonics, but I like coffee enemas. It's hard for me to do them every day, and all that, but I've done them, maybe 3 a week or so, and I can do that. But I think if you have cancer and you really need to get detoxified, that the coffee enemas have been proven to, really, really help a lot. And I think it's a big deal. A lot of people that I've talked to also have done the coffee enemas.
So is there anything else stand out? You mentioned hyperbaric oxygen, high-dose enzyme therapy, high-dose vitamin C, coffee enemas, diet change, eliminating toxins and poisons from your life, getting your spirit right. Anything else stand out in the interviews that you've done that the audience would find helpful?
Well, I think that the visualization is a big deal. I mentioned it earlier, but when you visualize your brain, and it starts to focus on that area, and it starts to send the energy, the healing energy there. Because, you can sit there and think about your hand, and after a while, you start to feel sensations in your hand. The mind is so powerful that I think the visualization helped me a lot, and meditation is very important, because I did a lot of this stuff back when I had the time to sit, and I chewed my food, as I said, 180 times, because, when you chew your food, it takes a load off of your digestive system. Every time you got to break down food, that's just more work. The more, it's just like eating heavy amounts of fatty foods, red meat, lots of red meat and animal protein. And when you do that, it's a stress on your enzymes. It's a stress on your trypsin and chymotrypsin, which are produced in the pancreas. And, there's other things that help, that they believe, and I like a little meat, red meat, but of course I eat the stuff the very best of the best. And there's some people think that there's certain amino acids, but what I feel is very important. I've discovered that cancer is a collagen disease through Dr. Matthias Rath's work. And, he did a lot of work with Linus Pauling, and he discovered that vitamin C is really the key, because it strengthens the collagen, the connective tissue. And the cancer spreads, it metastasizes through this tissue, because it's got an enzyme called nagalase. And nagalase can eat right through this stuff, but if you strengthen it, that collagen, it has a very hard time. And vitamin C also, along with iron and copper, produces hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide, you're talking about once the cancer is introduced to that and it gets exposed to this, you start to get the cancer cells commit suicide or apoptosis. So that's the whole theory of it all. But these are just very important things that I talk about in the book. The book is basically very easy to read. It tells my story, and I think it would inspire anybody that's going through this, or anybody knows someone. We all know somebody, because it's pretty soon it's going to be 1 out of 2 of us is going to have some kind of cancer in our lifetime. And it's getting close to that now. I think they say, and who knows, it's 1 out of 2 men and 1 out of 3 women. And they say it's getting in a little closer to 1 out of 2 across the board. But, it's all about the immune system. It's all about, keeping your immune system strong. There's a lot of things you can do, other things that I recommend on a regular basis that I've done, things I've discovered. And, it shouldn't be, it doesn't mean anything's foolproof. We can still get anything. But your chances are going to be a lot lower of getting cancer. And who wants to go through that? It about destroyed my life, and it destroys a lot of people's lives. And I got sick and tired of seeing my friends and family and colleagues, come down with cancer, and many of them pass away. And about 1.5 years ago, I decided that I was going to start the Templeton Wellness Foundation. And this foundation is the foundation we were talking about, and I want to give back. All the proceeds from my book go to the foundation. I don't take any affiliate money. I don't do anything, because this is something I feel like is kind of my mission now, to give back. And I want to help people help themselves. It's like nobody can do it for them, but if I can do it, they can do it, those other people, then why can't they? That, and it's just, you just have to go within yourself and just get down and dirty and do it, and it can be done, and it's just whatever somebody wants to do, it's up to them. But I know I did some of the conventional, I did chemotherapy, and I did surgery. Maybe that helped me a lot more than I think, but I wasn't going to stick around there and find out. I was going to do something. Once I learned some important things that I could do, I was going to go out there and I was going to do everything I could. But I talk about it, and the foundation's all about getting back and learning all the things I can from people that are real survivors. And most of these people have survived for 10 years or more, and they've survived stage 4, most of them, some 3 and 4, and they have been pretty much written off, and they survived. And, we're taking the common threads, we're putting those common threads together, and we're, going to share all those with people. We're also doing a restaurant guide. of the healthiest restaurants in America. Because when I got sick, I thought my life was kind of going to be, I was going to be living in a kind of a jail cell, even though I was ready to do that because I wanted to feel good and I made up my mind I wanted to live. I wanted to be there for my daughter someday. I wanted to be there for others. I knew that I was supposed to help others, but I had to help myself. And when it got to be about 30 years, I said, now's the time. People will believe me more, because I've survived all these years and I continue to survive. And, I think most people would say, oh, I'll take 30 years anytime, and I wanted to, I want to make a difference and give back. And it's almost like a ministry to me to help as many people as I can. And that's pretty much it. And the restaurant guide, they can find that at the templetonwellness.com. We're almost finished with it. It's almost ready to go. It should be ready here in a few days. And we've been, for a lot of this year, we've been working on the restaurants and putting it all together. Because, like I said before, when you get sick, you think, well, my life's over. I can't go anywhere, do anything anymore. And if you're sick, it's important to eat at home and where you can control everything. But a lot of us like to go out sometimes, or we're traveling. I'm sure you travel. I travel. And, I want to go to a place that I know is using organic. They're not using, GMO foods, and they're, which would probably mean if they were, we'd be taking glyphosates and everything else, from the Roundups and the herbicides and pesticides and all that. And I want organic. I want filtered water because water's a big problem. All the water that you put in your body should be the purest that you can find, and don't drink out of plastic water bottles, and don't, occasionally we all have to do that, but there's so many things, that you have to be aware of, but in my book, you're going to discover most of those things, and I'm sure you'll see there'll probably, there'll be things in there that are common sense, and a lot of things you're going to learn new things, but it's so important, to become a health conscious, warrior person. And, if you are, you're going to help yourself. You're going to be able to help your family. You're going to be able to thrive, be successful, and live a lot longer time. That's my view.
Amen to that. Well, James, thanks so much for coming on tonight and sharing your story. People can find you at you repeat your website for us so we can get that plugged in for us.
TempletonWellness.com or IUsedToHaveCancer.com, and that's the title of the book. It's if they go to IUsedToHaveCancer.com, they can order the book on there if they want, because with that they'll get 3 free downloads. The top 5 supplements that I believe are the most important. They're also going to get 10 healthy recipes that I think are really good recipes to follow, to use. And they're also going to see my daily routine, the things that I do, kind of my schedule, the things that I take, the things that I, if they're going through they want to be preventative or they're going through something, they're going to see kind of, the schedule of my daily routine. So that we're going to give them that, and that just a little bit bonus. And I hope they'll go to the restaurant guide and use that, because that anywhere in the country they'll be able to go on. They'll see we've tested them all out, and if it's good enough for us, it'll be good enough for anybody else, I believe.
That's excellent. Well, thanks for all your hard work that you're doing, and thanks for sharing your story. I know that's got to be challenging and emotional for you to come out and talk about that and bring that up. But I think people are going to take power from that. And as you said, you got to be a health warrior. I firmly believe in the warrior mentality. I'm often called that gluten-free warrior. So I love that. I love your story. And I thank you so much for writing this book and for sharing it with us and my audience tonight. You heard him, folks. You can go to IUsedToHaveCancer.com. You can go to TempletonWellness.com. Pick up that free healthy restaurant guide. It's coming out here very soon in the book. You can pre-order it now, and I highly encourage you and ask you to support James and James's mission, because I think it's very vital and very important for others who are trying to find answers and are struggling from cancer. So, James, again, thank you so much for being on with us tonight. And folks, we got to wrap it up. It's we went extra special over 15 minutes just for James. But yeah, thank you.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Osborne, for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
Well, you're very welcome. And we'll be in touch soon. Have a great evening.
I hope to see you down in Houston again sometime.
Yeah, me too. Hope to see you as well.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye.